Thomas Erickson learned early what steel meant. Not the metal itself, though he knew that intimately too, but what it represented. His father had worked 32 years at the Homestead Works before the emphysema took him, and his grandfather had been there since before the strike of 19. 3 generations of Erickson men had walked through those gates, breathing in the same metallic air, feeling the same blast of heat from the open hearths, hearing the same symphony of industry that had defined this town since Andrew Carnegie first built it. Steel is America, his father had told him, hand heavy on his shoulder as they watched the molten pour on Thomas's first day. And Homestead is steel. He believed it completely. How could he not? The sprawling 7-mile complex of U.S. Steel's Homestead Works dominated the Monongahela River, its 8 blast furnaces silhouetted against the sky like a mountain range. In 1975, when Thomas first started, nearly 15,000 workers filled those buildings. The plant was a universe unto itself, with its own rhythms, language, and laws. Thomas stood at the basic oxygen furnace, watching the transformer spark and hiss. Sweat ran down his back despite the February chill outside. After 21 years, his body had acclimated to these extremes. Freezing mornings scraping ice off his windshield, then sweltering afternoons where temperatures near the furnaces could hit 130 degrees. His hands, once soft, were now maps of calluses and small burns, each mark a story of the steel that had built America's skyscrapers, bridges, and warships. But something had changed. Thomas felt it more than saw it. A hesitancy in management, meeting rooms with closed doors, phone calls that stopped when workers entered offices. Production had been slowing for months. Foreign steel, they said. Japanese imports. New technology. Thomas wiped his face with a bandana and checked his watch. For hours until shift change. Hey, Erickson. Alan Dempsey, floor supervisor, appeared through the steam. Meeting in the main hall at 3. Mandatory. What about? Thomas asked, but Alan was already walking away, clipboard pressed to his chest like armor. The worry Thomas had been suppressing resurfaced. He remembered his father's words when layoffs first hit in the early 80s. Don't worry, Tommy. They need skilled men. They need Americans who know steel. His father had believed it until they'd wheeled his oxygen tank into the unemployment office to file for benefits. At 3 o'clock, Thomas joined the crowd of men shuffling into the meeting hall. Their faces were still streaked with soot, hands black with grease. No one had been allowed to clean up first, a bad sign. Management always let you wash before good news. Thomas spotted his crew, men he'd worked alongside for decades. There was Martin, who'd lost 3 fingers in '82 but came back after 8 weeks. There was Phil, who'd put 3 kids through college on steel wages. And Raymond, who at 62 still outworked men half his age. These weren't just co-workers. They were the men who'd pulled Thomas from a conveyor belt malfunction that would have taken his arm. They were the men who'd carried his father's casket. Regional Vice President Warren Campbell stood at the podium, his clean suit and manicured nails marking him as someone who hadn't made steel in decades, if ever. Behind him stood a row of other executives, their faces carefully arranged to convey appropriate solemnity. As you know, Campbell began, U.S. Steel has been facing unprecedented challenges in the global marketplace. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He'd heard speeches that started this way before. They always ended the same. Despite extensive efforts to remain competitive, we have made the difficult decision to permanently close the Homestead Works facility, effective March 1986. The date hit Thomas like physical blow. March. 2 weeks away. A roar went up from the men. Anger, disbelief, questions hurled like weapons. Campbell raised his hands for quiet, but it was Raymond who silenced the room, his weathered voice cutting through the chaos. What about the pension guarantees from '83? What about the healthcare extensions you promised? Campbell's expression didn't change. All contractual obligations will be reviewed by our legal team. You'll receive information packets. Reviewed? Phil shouted. We already reviewed them. We already agreed. The company's financial situation has changed significantly since those agreements were made, Campbell said. We'll be offering severance based on years of service, but I need to be honest. It won't be what was originally promised. Thomas stood motionless as the reality settled over him. It wasn't just jobs disappearing. It was the promise. The understanding that if you gave your body to the mill, your hearing, your lungs, your youth, the company would take care of you. His false belief, so fundamental he'd never questioned it. Lay exposed. Loyalty would be rewarded. Hard work guaranteed security. Steel was forever. The meeting dissolved into angry clusters. Men shouted, some cried, others stood in stunned silence. Thomas walked out, unable to process everything at once. Outside, the massive complex continued operating. Furnaces burning, cranes moving, metal being formed, like a body not yet aware it was dying. He drove home to find his wife, Audrey, waiting, tension visible in the line of her shoulders. Their daughter, Emma, 16 and determined to be anywhere but Homestead, was upstairs with her music too loud. They told you, Audrey said, seeing his face. Thomas nodded, setting his lunchbox down on the kitchen counter. 21 years of the same routine, hanging his coat, washing his hands at the sink, sitting down to whatever Audrey had waiting. The familiar motions felt wrong now, disconnected from their purpose. March 1st, he said finally. 2 weeks. Audrey closed her eyes briefly. The severance? Not what they promised. He couldn't meet her eyes. They're reviewing the pension too. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, a General Electric they'd bought during better times, when overtime was plentiful and Thomas had been made foreman of his section. The payments on the house had seemed manageable then. So had the car loan. And Emma's college fund, a promise they'd made to ensure she'd never have to depend on a company's goodwill. We'll figure it out, Audrey said finally, reaching across the table to take his still blackened hand. We always do. But Thomas heard the fear beneath her words. Homestead wasn't just losing jobs. It was losing its purpose, its identity. Who was Thomas Erickson without the steel mill? Who was Homestead without U.S. Steel? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of numb disbelief. Thomas moved through his shifts mechanically, memorizing every sound, every smell, every view. The thunderous roar of the oxygen furnace. The distinctive sulfur metal scent that had permeated his clothes for so long Audrey had stopped noticing it. The orange-white glow of molten steel pouring like artificial sunrise. On the last day, February 28, 1986, Thomas arrived for the night shift to find the locker room unusually quiet. Men who normally joked and argued sat silently at benches, some already packing personal items from lockers they'd used for decades. Heard they're demolishing building 4 next month, Raymond said, carefully folding a faded photograph of his crew from 1970. Germantown's going first. The whole thing will be gone within 2 years, Phil added. They're not mothballing it this time. Complete demolition. The thought of the massive complex being reduced to rubble seemed impossible. The Homestead Works had survived the Great Depression, multiple strikes, 2 world wars. It had produced the steel for the Panama Canal, for the Golden Gate Bridge, for the Empire State Building. How could something so permanent simply vanish? Their final shift passed with strange intensity. Each task, checking gauges, adjusting valves, monitoring temperatures, felt weighted with significance. Thomas found himself working with deliberate precision, as if perfect execution on this last night could somehow demonstrate what the company was throwing away. At 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before shift change, the unusual happened. Production stopped early. Normally the handover between shifts was seamless, the mill never ceasing its work. But today, furnaces were being powered down, machinery quieted. At 6:58, Thomas stood with his crew beneath the clock they'd all watched for years, waiting for the shift whistle one last time. When it sounded, that familiar piercing wail, no one moved. The next shift wasn't coming. There would be no handover, no continuation of the work. Raymond removed his hard hat first, then the others followed. Thomas held his in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the grooves his head had worn into the liner over 21 years. Guess that's it, Phil said. They walked out together into the cold March dawn. The parking lot, usually bustling with arriving day shift workers, was nearly empty. A few security guards stood near the gate, their presence a reminder that the men who had given decades to this place were now outsiders. Thomas drove home slowly, following the Monongahela River as it curved past the mill that had shaped its banks for generations. He should have been exhausted after working all night, but adrenaline kept him alert, his mind racing. Audrey was waiting, as she always did after his night shifts, coffee ready and the kitchen warm. It's done, he said simply. She nodded, sliding a mug toward him. Did you say goodbye to everyone? Some. Others couldn't talk. He stared into his coffee. Alan said they're posting some maintenance positions next week. Skeleton crew to keep things running until the demolition starts. Hope flickered briefly in Audrey's eyes. Will you apply? Thomas shook his head. They'll hire young guys. Cheaper. No pension obligations. The bitterness surprised him. He'd always defended the company, even during previous layoffs. That afternoon, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Thomas drove back to 8th Avenue. The main street of Homestead had once been a thriving commercial district, restaurants filled with steelworkers, shops that stayed open late to accommodate shift schedules, banks that had grown fat on mill payrolls. Now, at what should have been a busy lunch hour, the street was eerily quiet. For rent signs hung in windows. Michael's restaurant, where they'd celebrated his promotion in '79, was closed, newspapers covering its windows. Thomas parked and walked, nodding to the few people he passed, all wearing the same stunned expression he felt on his own face. At Dorothy's diner, he found Raymond, Phil, and a half-dozen other mill workers sitting in silence over cooling coffee cups. Thought you'd be sleeping, Raymond said as Thomas slid into the booth. Can't, Thomas admitted. Phil pushed a newspaper across the table. The headline read, Homestead Works closure marks end of steel ERA. Below it, a subheading, up to 4,000 jobs lost as Pittsburgh region's industrial decline continues. 4,000, Thomas repeated. Remember when it was 15,000? Those were already the bad times according to my father. Dorothy herself brought Thomas coffee without being asked. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Half her customers would be gone within months, seeking work elsewhere. My boy got a job in North Carolina, she said, refilling cups. Some furniture factory. Wants me to sell up and move down there. You going? Phil asked. Dorothy shrugged. Where else is there to go? This place is dying. The brutal honesty of her words hung over the table. Homestead wasn't just losing jobs, it was losing its purpose. Since 1881, the town had existed to make steel and support those who made it. Every store, church, school, and home had been built around that reality. The union's opening an emergency center tomorrow, Raymond said. Help with unemployment claims. Job referrals, though God knows where they'll refer us to. Thomas nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. For 21 years, he'd risen each morning with absolute certainty of his role in the world. He was a steelworker. His labor had value. His skills mattered. His dedication earned security. Now what? The weeks after the closure revealed how thoroughly Thomas's identity had been built around the mill. He found himself waking at odd hours, his body still attuned to shift schedules that no longer existed. Mornings stretched endlessly, unstructured and purposeless. He applied for jobs, maintenance positions, security work, even retail, but his applications disappeared into silence. At 46, with skills specific to steelmaking, he had become suddenly obsolete. At the unemployment office, he stood in line with men he'd worked alongside for decades. Men who'd once produced the material that built skyscrapers now waited for government forms, their calloused hands awkward around ballpoint pens, their voices lowered as they asked about food stamps and heating assistance. The financial reality hit quickly. The promised severance was reduced to a fraction of what had been agreed upon. The pension fund, supposedly guaranteed, was suddenly underfunded, and payouts were slashed. Health insurance disappeared after 3 months. By summer, Thomas and Audrey were making calculations they'd never imagined. Which bill could be paid late? What items were luxuries rather than necessities? How long their savings might stretch if they were careful. Emma needs shoes for school, Audrey said one evening, bills spread across the kitchen table. And the car insurance is due next week. Thomas stared at the numbers that refused to add up. I'll try the fabrication shop in McKeesport again. They said they might be hiring in August. That's what they said in June. Audrey reminded him gently. Maybe we should consider selling the house. My sister said we could stay with her in Cleveland until, no. The word came out sharper than he intended. This is our home. We're not leaving. Audrey didn't argue, but the reality hung between them. Homestead was emptying. The grocery store on 8th Avenue had closed in May. The hardware store followed in July. Even the bars were shuttering, despite the fact that unemployed men had more time than ever to drink. In August, Thomas stood among a crowd watching as demolition began on the first Homestead Works building. The massive structure that had housed one of the open hearth furnaces, where his father had worked for 30 years, was being dismantled piece by piece. Giant mechanical claws tore at the steel skeleton, the screech of metal echoing across the river. "Heard they're going to build a shopping center," Raymond said, standing beside Thomas at the chain-link fence that now surrounded the property. "Some developer from Philadelphia bought the whole riverfront." Thomas watched as a section of wall collapsed, sending up a cloud of dust that had probably contained his father's DNA, particles of the man mixed with the building he'd given his life to. "A shopping center," Thomas repeated. "Who's going to shop there? Nobody in Homestead has jobs. That's the point, isn't it?" Raymond's voice was bitter. "They don't want us here anymore. They want new people. People who buy things." Thomas understood then what he'd been refusing to see. This wasn't a temporary setback. It wasn't a market fluctuation or a strategic adjustment. It was the end of a way of life. The death of a world where men like him, men who worked with their hands, who made tangible things, who built America, had a secure place. That night, he sat alone on his porch, watching the empty street. The neighborhood had already begun changing. The Kowalskis had left for Chicago in June. The Patterson house stood empty, a foreclosure sign in the overgrown yard. Even the Thompson family, third generation in Homestead, had packed up for Virginia where their son had found work in a shipping warehouse. Thomas realized he was waiting for the mill to reopen, waiting for things to return to normal, waiting for the world to remember it needed men like him. But it wasn't going to happen. Fall came, bringing with it a desperate edge to their situation. Thomas had found only sporadic work, 2 weeks helping demolish the very mill where he'd spent his career, a month at a warehouse where the manager made it clear he preferred younger workers who could move faster. Their savings were nearly gone. Emma got accepted to community college, Audrey said one evening, holding a letter, for the spring semester. Thomas looked up from the classified section he'd been circling with decreasing hope. "That's good. She needs the deposit by November." Audrey's voice was carefully neutral. "It's $800. The amount might as well have been $8 million. Thomas folded the newspaper and set it aside. "I'll figure something out." But they both knew there was nothing to figure out. The mill jobs weren't coming back. The economy of Homestead was collapsing. The skills Thomas had spent decades perfecting were worthless in this new world. That night, lying awake beside Audrey's sleeping form, Thomas confronted the belief that had structured his entire life. Hard work and loyalty would be rewarded. The company would take care of those who took care of it. There was honor and security in making things, in producing, in building. It had all been a lie. Or if not a lie, an agreement that only one side had felt bound to honor. The next morning, Thomas drove to what remained of the Homestead Works. Most of it was gone now, demolished over the summer and fall. Where massive buildings had stood, there were now only concrete foundations and scattered debris. The river flowed past unchanged, indifferent to the transformation of its banks. He parked and walked to the main gate, still standing though it no longer led anywhere. A security guard watched him warily but didn't intervene. Thomas stood there, facing the emptiness that had once been his world. The silence was what struck him most. The Homestead Works had never been silent. Even on holidays and overnight, some part of it was always in motion, always making noise. The steady heartbeat of industry. Now there was only wind and distant traffic. "Excuse me, sir? You can't be here." Thomas turned to find a young man in a suit approaching, clipboard in hand. "I worked here," Thomas said simply. The man's expression softened slightly. "I understand, but this is a construction site now. We're breaking ground for the waterfront development next month. The shopping center." "Shopping, entertainment, office space," the man corrected, clearly reciting a prepared description. "It's going to bring thousands of jobs to Homestead." Thomas almost laughed. "What kind of jobs?" "Retail, food service, maintenance, minimum wage," Thomas interrupted. "No benefits, no security." The man shifted uncomfortably. "It's better than nothing. And it's the future. This," he gestured at the demolished mill, "was the past." Thomas wanted to argue, to explain that what had happened wasn't progress, it was betrayal. But looking at the young man in his clean suit with his clipboard and his certainty, he realized the futility. This man couldn't understand what had been lost because he'd never experienced what had existed. "The future," Thomas repeated. He turned back toward his car, then paused. "Did you know they made the steel for the Empire State Building here? For the Panama Canal? For the ships that won World War II? The young man blinked, clearly unprepared for a history lesson. No, I didn't. Nobody will, Thomas said, and walked away. That evening, as Thomas sat at the kitchen table staring at bills he couldn't pay, the phone rang. Audrey answered it, her side of the conversation consisting mostly of yes and I understand, and finally, he's right here. She handed Thomas the receiver with an unreadable expression. Mr. Erickson? This is Robert Wilson from Allegheny Technical College. Thomas frowned. He'd applied for a maintenance position there months ago and never heard back. We're calling about a different opportunity than the one you originally applied for, Wilson continued. We're starting a new program in industrial arts and heritage skills, basically teaching traditional manufacturing techniques, metalworking, foundry work, the craftsmanship that built this region. Okay, Thomas said cautiously. We need instructors with real-world experience, people who actually worked in the mills, who know the processes, the techniques, the history. Thomas's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. You want me to teach? We want you to preserve what's being lost, Wilson said. These skills, your skills, they're disappearing. Maybe mass production is moving overseas, but there's still value in knowing how to work with metal, how to understand steel. There's still a future for craftsmen, even if the mills are gone. After the call ended, Thomas sat in silence, turning the proposition over in his mind. It wasn't the mill. It wasn't what he'd known. The pay was less than half what he'd made at U.S. Steel. But it was something else. Recognition that what he knew mattered. That his experience had value beyond what a company could extract from his labor. That perhaps the problem wasn't that his skills were obsolete, but that a system had decided they were too expensive to honor. What are you thinking? Audrey asked finally. Thomas looked up at her. I'm thinking about what my father told me on my first day at the mill. He said, steel is America, and Homestead is steel. I believed that my whole life. And now I'm thinking maybe he had it backwards. Maybe America isn't steel. Maybe America is what you do when the steel is gone. The next morning, Thomas drove to Allegheny Technical College to accept the teaching position. As he crossed the Homestead high-level bridge, he could see clear to the Monongahela River where the Homestead Works had once dominated the landscape. Now there was only emptiness waiting to be filled with something new. Thomas realized he was facing the same emptiness within himself. His identity, so long defined by the mill, by production, by his role in making tangible things, had been hollowed out. Now he had to decide what would fill that space. The college campus was nothing like the mill. Clean, quiet, orderly. No heat, no danger, no camaraderie forged in shared risk. But as Robert Wilson led him through a workshop where students were learning metalworking techniques, Thomas felt something unexpected, a flicker of recognition, of connection. A young woman was working at a forge, her face focused in concentration as she shaped a piece of glowing metal. The tools were smaller, the scale different, but the fundamental relationship between person and material remained. The students are eager to learn from someone with real experience, Wilson said. Most of them never saw the mills in operation. Thomas watched the young woman work, seeing both the errors in her technique and the potential in her determination. Without thinking, he moved forward. You're losing heat, he said. You need to work faster once it's out of the forge. She looked up, startled, then nodded and adjusted her pace. The metal responded, becoming more pliable under her hammer. Like that, she asked. Better, Thomas said, and for the first time in months, he felt useful, needed, connected to something larger than his own struggle. Over the following years, as Homestead transformed around him, Thomas discovered a new purpose. He couldn't stop the forces reshaping the economy, couldn't bring back the world he'd known, but he could preserve something of value from that world: knowledge, techniques, respect for materials and craftsmanship. He could help younger generations understand what had been lost and what could still be salvaged. The waterfront development did open, a sprawling complex of chain stores, restaurants, and movie theaters built on the bones of the Homestead Works. Thomas avoided it at first, unable to reconcile the frivolous consumption with the serious production that had once occupied the same space. But one day in 1999, 13 years after the mill closed, he found himself driving through the development with his granddaughter, 5-year-old Sophie. As they passed the spot where Building 4 had once stood, where Thomas had spent his first decade at the mill, Sophie pointed at a decorative installation near the main entrance. "What's that, Grandpa?" Thomas slowed the car. Rising from a concrete base was a massive ladle from the old mill, 15 feet tall, rusted and weathered, but unmistakable to anyone who had worked there. Beside it, a plaque explained that this had once been part of the steelmaking process at the historic Homestead Works. He parked the car and took Sophie's hand, walking toward the industrial relic now repurposed as public art. That held molten steel, he told her, his voice catching slightly. Hot as the sun. Men like me and your great-grandfather would guide it to pour the steel that built skyscrapers and bridges. Sophie looked from the ladle to Thomas, her expression serious. Were you scared? Thomas smiled. Sometimes. But mostly I was proud. We made things that mattered. Do you miss it? She asked with a child's directness. Thomas considered the question, looking around at what Homestead had become, so different from what it had been. The mill was gone. Most of his co-workers had scattered. The town had transformed into something unrecognizable to the men who had once filled its streets at shift change. I miss the certainty, he said finally. I miss knowing exactly who I was and what I was meant to do. But as he watched his granddaughter examine the enormous ladle with curiosity, he realized something else. The mill had given him identity, purpose, community, but it had also confined him, defined him too narrowly, convinced him that his worth was measured only in tons of steel produced. But you know what? He continued, kneeling to Sophie's level. If the mill hadn't closed, I wouldn't have become a teacher. And if I hadn't become a teacher, I wouldn't have had time to take my smart granddaughter to the Science Museum on a Tuesday afternoon. Sophie grinned and pulled him toward the car, ready for their planned outing. As they drove away from the waterfront, Thomas glanced in his rearview mirror at the ladle, a monument to what had been lost, but also a reminder that loss wasn't the end of the story. Homestead would never again be what it was. Neither would Thomas. The belief that had structured his life, that hard work at the mill guaranteed security and purpose, had proven false. But in its place, he'd found a more complex truth. Identity wasn't fixed. Purpose could be recreated. Value existed beyond production. The steel was gone, but the knowledge of how to make it, and the understanding of why that mattered, lived on in him. And through him, it would continue. As he drove across the Monongahela with his granddaughter chattering beside him, Thomas Erickson finally understood. It wasn't the mill that had made Homestead. It was the people. And they were still here, still making something of value, even if that something was different than before. Steel had built America, but Americans would build whatever came next.